Test. Test. There. Good evening. My name is Garson Hunter. I'm the current director of the Social Policy Research Unit. And I just want to handle one thing before we start. Just make sure that you parked in lot 14 or 15. The parking here is very aggressive on ticketing, and I have quite a stack to attest to the fines that you'll get here. Now, I'm just so delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Helen Caldicott tonight. When I was a student myself in 1983 at University of Calgary, we went out. Over 5,000 people in Calgary marched against cruise missiles cruise missile testing in Canada. And then Dr. Caldicott spoke at the auditorium in Calgary. And it was just the most impressive talk, and here we are 24 years later, and she's still giving these incredible talks, which speaks to activism. And I just want to put in a very brief plug. If you saw signs outside, you might have saw something that said SPERG or SPERG. And I just want to encourage the students to give some idea to supporting that initiative. It stands for the Saskatchewan Public Interest Research Group initiative by the students. So I just want to give you just encourage you to give some consideration to supporting that. Well, let's talk about Helen Caldicott, MD, pediatrician. In 1971, Dr. Caldicott played a major role in Australia's opposition to the French atmospheric nuclear testing in the Pacific. In 1975, she worked with the Australian trade unions to educate their members about the medical dangers of nuclear fuel cycle, with particular reference to uranium mining. While living in the United States from 1977 to 86, she co-founded the Physicians for Social Responsibility, an organization of over 23,000 doctors committed to educating their colleagues about the dangers of nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and nuclear war. On trips aboard, she helped start similar medical organizations in many other countries. The International Umbrella Group, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And she also founded the Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament in the United States in 1980. Dr. Caldicott has received many prizes and awards for her work. Most recently, the Lannan Foundation's 2003 Prize for Cultural Freedom. She has 19 honorary doctorate degrees and was personally nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for the famous scientist Linus Pauling, himself a Nobel laureate. The Smithsonian Institution has named Dr. Caldicott as one of the most influential women of the 20th century. She has also written numerous publications and has authored, I think, up to 6 or it might even be 7 books now. She's also been the subject of several films, including 8 Minutes to Midnight, nominated for the Academy Award in 1981, If You Love This Planet, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1982, and The Helen's War, Portrait of a Dissident, recipient of the Australian Film Institute Awards for the Best Direction 2004, and the Sydney Film Festival Denny Award for Best Documentary in 2004. Therefore, I don't want to keep going on and on because we'll be here all night listing her accomplishments. Rather, I'd introduce you to Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Bring the blackboard forward. That's great. Well, thank you very much for coming out to hear me. I guess it's not strange for you to come out on such a cold night, but for me it is. I've just left summer in Sydney, where I spent the last 5 months wearing no shoes, just bare feet, and really walking around in my bathing suit. So it's a little different here. I'm very pleased to be here, especially in this particular province, because you, in a way, have the fate of the earth in the palms of your hands. Like Australia, you have an enormous amount of uranium, as you well know, but your uranium is much richer than ours, and it's terribly valuable. And the best thing to do, according to many businessmen, is to dig it out as fast as possible and sell it, and that's probably why you're such a fairly wealthy province. It's interesting to note, though, that the first 3 nuclear weapons made by America, Trinity, named after the Father, Son and Holy Ghost. Little boy dropped on Hiroshima that killed about 120,000 people in a flash. And Fat Man that was dropped on Nagasaki that killed about 80,000 people in a flash. The fuel for those weapons came from here. America constructed about 77,000 hydrogen bombs over time. Just to put that into context, 1,000 hydrogen bombs dropping on 100 cities, because many cities are multiply targeted, there's such a redundancy of weapons. 1,000 bombs dropping on 100 cities could possibly cause nuclear winter, and the earth enveloped in a cloud of smoke so thick it blocks out the sun for a year and freezes to death most creatures on the planet, much worse than global warming that we're dealing with. So America made 77 times more than the nuclear winter. What am I trying to think of? Nuclear winter estimate of the number of bombs necessary. America has had a nuclear addiction, in other words, for years, and you've been the enablers. It's like you've got a father who's an alcoholic, and finally you say, look, Dad, I'm sick of finding your vodka bottles in the umbrella stand. I'm taking you to the drying out centre because I love you. You have made money out of supplying this material for nuclear weapons, and you have in fact helped to create the global gas oven. And I'm not being excessive when I say that. That's true. Now, people might think that now the Cold War is over and the Berlin Wall came down, thank God, and that was brought about by many of us who worked against the Cold War in those years, that everything's okay and we're all safe now. The truth is exactly the opposite. The Berlin Wall did come down, the Cold War did end, we got to be friendly with the Russians. George Bush looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes and said, I can see a soul I can trust. But what we really need to know is that the weapons were not removed. We were also tired at the end of that huge exercise to end the Cold War, that when it ended, I sat back on the couch and thought, thank God I can rest now. And I think most of us thought that. But unfortunately, we got a man into office in America called William Jefferson Clinton, who had no courage. He had smoked some dope, although he said he didn't inhale. I don't really believe him. He had not been to Vietnam, so he didn't feel he had the credentials to take on the Pentagon. He liked people to like him, and there's a lot of literature on that. And instead of getting into Air Force One and flying over to Moscow and meeting with Yeltsin, who was a compliant man and who was a severe alcoholic, and writing out a treaty to say we're going to eliminate nuclear weapons, sign here, Boris, he didn't do it. So the legacy that Clinton has left is that America has 5,500 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, in the missile silos, in the Trident submarines, ready to be launched. There are 2 men in each missile silo, each armed with a pistol, one to shoot the other if one shows signs of deviant behaviour. That means the deviant one could shoot the other one and launch a missile and start a nuclear war. 5,500. There's an hair trigger alert means that they're ready to go, and George Bush, who's the decider, he says, and who is the commander-in-chief and who has the button at his side at all times. If you watch the president carefully, always walking just behind him is a man with a suitcase, and it's called the football. And inside the football are the codes to start a nuclear war. It's always with him, and when Ronald Reagan was shot, they lost the football for 2 days. They didn't know where it went. When George Bush met with the late Pope, underneath the table where they were talking sat the football, which could destroy God's creation. I don't think the Pope mentioned what that meant to him, to George Bush. So George Bush has 3 minutes to decide whether or not to press the button. You know those big screens in NORAD? You're part of NORAD. And the early warning system, which show whether or not missiles are coming to you from Russia, those early warning systems make mistakes quite frequently. And if George Bush is woken up at 3 a.m. from REM 4 sleep and they say, Mr. President, you've got 3 minutes to decide whether or not to launch a nuclear war, I'm not quite sure how he would react, even when he's not in REM 4 sleep. But the real truth is he has 3 options. 1, a counterforce option, which is to launch all the missiles to drop on the Russian missile silos and, quotes, kill their missiles. 2, a counterforce option, which is to bomb all the cities and kill millions of people. Or 3, to do both. So he doesn't really have an option to press or not to press. He has in that 3 minutes an option which one to decide to do. Now, the Russians are on a similar footing. They have only 2,500 nuclear weapons, but there's such a redundancy of weapons today in the world because there are only 340 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere, that's all. So because of the redundancy of weapons, there are 40 hydrogen bombs targeted on New York City alone. Robert McNamara and I wrote an article about that for the LA Times. 40 on Washington. You would have at least 1 bomb targeted on you because you're a university city, and all universities in Northern America are targeted with at least 1 bomb. They used to target railroad crossings. They target all major industrial facilities, all military facilities, the whole thing. So you are targeted by Russia. And so is the United States, and so is Australia, because we've got 34 US military bases there. We really are the 51st state of the United States of America. That's if you don't count Canada. We are in a very dangerous situation, much more dangerous now than at the height of the Cold War. Why? Well, A, nobody knows that those weapons are still there. Hands up those who knew what I just said. Yeah, well, we've got a well-educated audience here. 2, the Russian early warning system is dilapidated. Now, an early warning system works like this. You have the globe, and Russia has satellites, or used to have satellites, so that if America launched its missiles, the satellites pick up the attack and radio back to Moscow. However, the Russian satellites don't work anymore, because they don't have the money to keep them up, because they're poor. All they have is over-the-horizon radar, which can just detect maybe some missiles coming in just before they land. So the Russians are pretty paranoid. And they know that America still has a policy to fight and win a nuclear war, a preemptive secret nuclear war. How do you do that? Well, the way you do it is this. You knock out Moscow with a first strike attack, and that's called decapitation, because you kill Putin before he gets to press his button. Okay? Then you launch all your, or at the same time you launch all your missiles and knock out all their 2,500 hydrogen bombs. So you win the nuclear war. The fact that millions die and probably a nuclear winter will be created is beside the point. In the Pentagon's definition of winning, America's won the nuclear war. The fact that nuclear winter will probably be created and the whole Earth enveloped in a cloud of smoke that blocks out the sun for a year is also beside the point to the Pentagon. Now, the Russians know that this could happen. So because they don't want to lose the nuclear war and lose their missiles, they have got a great big cavern in the Ural Mountains, and they put a missile in there called the Dead Hand. So if Putin and Moscow gets decapitated, up goes the Dead Hand missile, which sends a message electronically to all the missile silos in Russia to launch without any human input. If you want to look it up, Google it. Dead Hand. Go to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, what I'm telling you. So the problem is that here we are on the brink of nuclear annihilation, much closer than we were during the height of the Cold War, when I went to see President Reagan and spent an hour and a quarter holding his hand in the White House trying to teach him about nuclear weapons, about which he knew very little, if not nothing. Actually, I wrote about this in this book. That's my autobiography. I wrote about the Reagan interview, which is kind of interesting because I established a doctor-patient relationship with him and held his hand much of the time because he got quite anxious because he didn't know anything. And I was trying to teach him. It's much more dangerous now. And nobody is talking about this. Not one head of government or state, including Nelson Mandela. One person is talking about it, and that's Gorbachev. And Gorbachev and Reagan did get together in Reykjavik, I think in 1987 in Iceland. And over a weekend, two mere mortals almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons. They didn't do it because Reagan was hung up on Star Wars. You know, he had this sort of shield, like a yellow plastic shield over America, and the missiles would come in and go boink, boink, and bounce off it. I mean, it was a Disney thing, which was appropriate because he was from Hollywood. Gorbachev was pig-headed. He should have said to Reagan, okay, you can have your missile defense because it will never work anyway, but let's abolish nuclear weapons. So it was Gorbachev's obstinacy and Reagan's pig-headedness that caused us not to eliminate nuclear weapons. So they're all still there, and Clinton's legacy is what I've just described. And for that, I resent him. I don't care how nice he is. Now, you need to know that in 1995, in January, Norway launched a missile, an old American missile with a weather satellite on it. And the Russian early warning system, which was fairly operative at the time, 1995, picked up the missile and said, oh my God, America's launched a first strike, because that's the Pentagon policy. For the first time ever in Moscow, they opened the Russian football. Never been opened before. And there's Boris Yeltsin, a hardened alcoholic, you know, a bottle of vodka for breakfast. Korsakoff syndrome, Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is what you get brain rot from alcohol, and that's why he's not president now, was sitting before the football and he had 3 minutes decision time. His generals were standing over his shoulder saying, Mr. President, press the button. 10 seconds before that 3-minute interval elapsed, the missile veered off course, and they realised they were not under attack, and they closed the football. That's why here we are sitting in this auditorium and we're not radioactive atoms floating around in the stratosphere. That, I would say, is too close for comfort. Those emergencies occur not infrequently. The US Navy recently found out that the whole early warning system was open to being hacked into by hackers. They had to change the whole system. It took them months and months and months and months. You remember Y2K? When the computers had to be changed at the year 2000, there was a big worry that things would go wrong. I went to the White House. I spoke to the Pentagon by a conference call, and they said, don't worry, we've got it all under control, no worries. The fact is that they were changing their computer systems at the time, and they lost their early warning computers for about 7 months. So they were lying to me. And you are part of this system because you're part of NORAD. You are selling the uranium to America, which is currently building new nuclear weapons. Did you know that? Yeah, they've got a program which I describe in this book. I like this book because it's got a cover with George Bush looking like Alfred E. Newman on it, looking up at a nuclear explosion. But the labs, Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos, have a new program called Stockpile Stewardship and Maintenance, which abbreviates to SSM, which quite amuses me. But it is that they are designing, developing, testing and building new nuclear weapons. Why? Well, you've got to keep the scientists occupied and developing new nuclear weapons. Now they're building a reliable replacement warhead, RRW, reliable replacement. They have lovely names for all of this stuff. So if America's building new nuclear weapons, even though it has now 11,000, some of them in storage, and they all will work for the next 100 years, according to the scientists. If America's doing it, why shouldn't Iran? Why shouldn't North Korea? Why shouldn't Australia? And what America doesn't get is it is the model for the whole world in terms of global warming, uses of oil, cars, automobiles, SUVs, and nuclear weapons. And it's so arrogant and short-sighted, myopic, that it doesn't accept its responsibility that it has to be the model for the whole world. So do you. But I'll get into that in a little while. I want to, just to finish this little talk on nuclear war and the threat that we all live under every day, drop a bomb on this beautiful auditorium to describe the medical implications of what I'm talking about, because I'm a physician. You ready? You know, sometimes you're listening to the radio and you hear, "Ooh," and a man says, "We are just testing the emergency broadcasting system." Do you get that? Well, they do in America. Okay, so say you had your radio on and they said, "This is not a test, we are under nuclear attack." The weapons take 30 minutes to go from Moscow and Russia to land here, 30 minutes. You would not hear the weapon coming in because it comes in at 20 times the speed of sound, too fast to hear it. It will explode with the heat inside the center of the sun. That's why when Robert Oppenheimer saw the first bomb explode in the desert called Trinity, he said, "I have become death, the shatterer of worlds," because he knew he'd harnessed the energy of the stars. This bomb will explode and dig a hole 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us and the buildings and the earth below to radioactive fallout shot up in the mushroom cloud. 5 miles from the epicenter here, every person will literally be vaporized. A little boy in Hiroshima was reaching up to catch a red dragonfly in his hand against the blue of the sky, and there was a blinding flash, and he did literally disappear and left his shadow on the pavement. And if you go to the Hiroshima Museum, there is his shadow. 5 miles out. 20 miles out, everyone grotesquely burnt. But don't worry, the White House has been stockpiling large quantities of morphine just in case there's a nuclear war. But doctors, we will be similarly dead or injured. There'll be no hospitals, no syringes, and we don't know where the morphia is. Winds of 500 miles an hour, you know, a hurricane's 150 miles an hour, 500 miles an hour, suck people out of buildings and turn them into missiles traveling at 100 miles an hour. So everyone virtually is dead with a 20-mile radius. And then out to 50 miles, if you look at the flash, you'll be instantly and permanently blinded from retinal burns. The whole area would be engulfed in a firestorm of 3,000 square miles. Even on a day like this with snow all over the ground, everything spontaneously combusts. And as the fires coalesce across the country, the whole of the North American continent, not right up north into Canada, but the whole of the US will be enveloped in one massive conflagration. And as things burn up goes the smoke to form the nuclear winter cloud. If in fact you got into a fallout shelter and you weren't incinerated or asphyxiated as the oxygen is used up by the fire, you can't come out for 6 months because the fallout's so intense, you'll get acute radiation illness, your hair will fall out, you'll vomit and bleed to death. What about food? Well, they say they'll use the old people to be the food gatherers because we won't live long enough to get our cancers because it will be so radioactive. In other words, what I'm talking about is the end of life on the planet. What about getting your politicians educated about this and talking about it? What about Canada taking a stand like New Zealand did? Surely you've got the courage that the New Zealanders had. They got well educated and they stopped American ships coming into their harbours with nuclear weapons on them. There were huge demonstrations. In fact, in one of them, a big Trident submarine came into New Zealand and a man climbed on the Trident with a bucket of yellow paint and started painting the submarine yellow. You know, we all live in a yellow submarine. They had a sense of humour. And they had a very good Prime Minister called David Lange, who said, "We refuse to sit in the dress circle of the nuclear theatre." Isn't it time that you did that? Have you got the courage? Okay, now let's get on to the main issue at hand, which is Saskatchewan and what you're doing here. I use a blackboard because it helps me explain things. I'm going to start at the beginning with uranium mining. Can you see the blackboard over there? You probably can't. Okay, now you've got tons of uranium and you're digging it up. Now, what is uranium? It's a radioactive material that's naturally occurring, and it decays to a series of what they call daughters, not sons, but daughters. One of them is radium, and Madame Curie refined radium and used to walk around with a little bit in her pocket playing with it. She didn't know that it was dangerous. She died of leukemia, and so did her daughter, who also worked on radium. Another one is radon gas, which causes lung cancer if inhaled. And uranium itself gives off what's called gamma radiation, like X-rays, from the ore face as the men mine uranium. So that 30 to 50% of men who've mined uranium in the past have died of lung cancer by inhaling radon gas. I hear that most of your uranium miners are Indigenous people, and they say they've got to have the jobs, right? Ecological racism, practiced all over the world, but particularly here in America. So give the jobs to those people and they get their cancers. Well, and I don't know if they're compensated. Are they even told what the dangers are before they mine? In Australia, our miners are not taught the dangers. I once went to a uranium mine and told them about the dangers, and the uranium miners were so upset. Many left. They demanded a health clinic. One man said, "I'm 26. They used to collect their urine in milk bottles once a week to measure the radiation levels of radium in the milk, in the urine." He said, "I'm already excreting radium in my urine. Both my parents died of cancer. What does that mean?" He had a predisposition to getting cancer. He was already contaminated with radium, which is a bone seeker and deposits in bone, where it irradiates just a small volume of cells to cause cancer. I need to walk you through how radiation causes cancer and the different forms of radiation. So there's gamma radiation, like X-rays, goes straight through you. Oh, and when men mine uranium, their testicles are exposed to gamma radiation, and radiation damages the genes in the sperm. I'll get to that in a minute. There's alpha radiation and beta radiation and gamma radiation, like X-rays. Alpha radiation is given off by radium and radon, and it's only a little particle. Here's the atom. This is the GE symbol. GE makes good things for life, like nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. Ironing boards, irons, stoves, refrigerators, all good things for life. An alpha particle is 2 protons and 2 neutrons emitted from the atom. It doesn't travel far. You can hold an alpha emitter in your hand and the radiation doesn't get through the dead layers of the skin. But if you inhale it, the living cells are affected and can be mutated. Beta radiation is an electron emitted. It's smaller, travels further than the heavy one, but they all do the same thing and mutate genes. Okay, now let's get into how radiation causes cancer. Your body is composed of trillions of cells. In the cell is the nucleus, and in the nucleus are the chromosomes. Arranged on the chromosomes are the genes. In every cell, there are genes that control the rate of cell division called the regulatory genes. And what radiation does to genes, to that double helix spiral, DNA, is it biochemically changes the gene. That's called a mutation. It could kill a cell, and if it kills a cell, it doesn't matter because that cell's out. But if the regulatory gene is damaged, the cell sits quietly. You don't know your regulatory gene has been damaged. The cell sits quietly from 5 to 60 years, and that's called the latent period of carcinogenesis. It's the incubation time for cancer. And that's how the nuclear industry get away with what they do, because when the cancer arises, it doesn't wear a little flag saying, "I was made by some radon you inhaled from the tailings pile near the uranium mine in Saskatchewan." It doesn't identify its origin. But we know that radiation causes cancer from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki data. Little girls who had no breast tissue at the time of the bomb exploding had a very much higher incidence of breast cancer than other women because their little nidus of breast cells had become mutated and the regulatory gene had become mutated. If I sneeze on you, within a day or two you're sneezing, because the incubation time for a cold is 2 days. The same for flu. Measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, 3 weeks. Cancer, 5 to 60 years. Here lies the secret of the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry is a cancer industry whose transient byproduct is the production of electricity for about 30 years. I'll get into that in a minute. Now, the other cells that are incredibly important to life, not just in humans but animals, are the egg and the sperm. And in the egg and the sperm, there are only half the number of genes, so when they unite, they form the new individual. So every gene is important in the egg and the sperm, and if they're mutated, you can induce genetic disease. My specialty, cystic fibrosis, is the most common genetic disease of childhood, and almost all my patients die. I'm actually going to a wedding of a cystic fibrosis patient I was given when he was 7. He was navy blue. He couldn't walk. He was so cyanosed. Because of his willpower and mine, we got him through to 21. He had the first heart-lung transplant in Australia. He's now 45 and he's about to get married. He actually has had a stroke, but that's very rare. Most of them die. There are now over 16,000 genetic diseases described, 16,000 including diabetes, hemophilia, phenylketonuria, so many. And what we will be doing by increasing the amount of radiation in the background is increasing the incidence of genetic disease. Well, what about, we've always lived with background radiation, and it's background radiation that induced mutations so that fish develop lungs, so that birds develop wings. We are a product of mutation so that we stood on our hind limbs. We got an opposing thumb so we can do anything we want with the planet. We got this huge brain beyond our capacities to control it, I believe. And so radiation was important, but also the natural incidence of cancer that we see and have always seen in Egyptian mummies and the like is also a result of background radiation. But all radiation is deleterious. There are very few mutations that are good, like opposing thumbs. And the good mutations take millions and millions of years to evolve and survive in an environment. Almost all mutations are deleterious and cause disease. And radiation is cumulative. Each dose you get adds to your risk of getting cancer. So never have an unnecessary X-ray. Do not get your teeth X-rayed every year. My ex-husband was a radiologist. They make a lot of money. It's medically contraindicated to get your teeth X-rayed unless you've got a really bad root abscess or something. Mammograms are scary. The breast is a radiosensitive organ. They used to give much higher doses. The machines are more delicate now and sophisticated. But always know there's a risk. And don't have unnecessary X-rays. And it's medically contraindicated to increase any background radiation at all. But that's what the nuclear industry is about. It's about producing radiation. Okay, now when you dig up the uranium, how do you dig up uranium? What sort of fuel do you use to dig up uranium? Fossil fuel, oil. Oh, what does oil do when it's burnt? Causes carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide is responsible for 50% of global warming. Yet the nuclear industry, in its wickedness, will say nuclear power's clean and green. No emissions, right? How many times do you hear that? I don't believe in freedom of speech when scientists lie. I think it should be banned. Yep. Good. So every time you hear an ad on the radio, see an ad on television or in the paper, you call the editor and you say, that is a lie and you're not to do it anymore. And you know what? They'll respond to you. But be aggressive. Don't be polite. I know you're all very polite. But, you know, make your point so that they understand, and then you'd better send them a copy of my book, because the first chapter deals with nuclear power and global warming. So to get enough uranium for nuclear power, you have to dig up millions of tons. Then you have to crush it with big crushers, and then you have to enrich it. Why do you have to enrich uranium? What does that mean? Well, when you dig up uranium, it has two isotopes, uranium-238 and uranium-235, and this is only present in 0.7%, and it must be enriched to 3% for use in nuclear power. If it's enriched over 50%, you can make bombs with it. That's why they're worried about Iran, which wants to enrich uranium, and they're scared that they'll go ahead and make enough for bombs. They're 5 to 15 years from making any bombs, yet the United States is intent on going and bombing Iran. They've got 2 aircraft carrier groups up there now, and Cheney has said if America doesn't bomb Iran, Israel will. They're talking about using nuclear weapons on the nuclear facilities in Iran, which could cause such fallout it could kill 2.8 million people all across the subcontinent right over to Afghanistan. That's wicked. But the plans are all ready for them to go, and if you read Cy Hirsch in the New Yorker, he writes about this. Now, to enrich uranium-235, you have to turn uranium into uranium hexafluoride, which is a gas. And then you force the gas through little micropore filters. It's called diffusion. One side stays 235, the other side is 238, and you enrich the uranium, or you put it in big centrifuges, all of which incredibly energy consuming. Your uranium is enriched in America, in Paducah, Kentucky, where they use 2 huge old coal-fired plants to enrich the uranium. What happens when you burn coal? Make carbon dioxide. So at every step of the nuclear fuel chain, they're pouring out carbon dioxide. They also use a lot of CFC gas, which is banned under the Montreal Protocol because it damages the ozone. And in Australia, we have an epidemic of skin cancer and melanoma because our ozone's very thin down there. But the nuclear industry has been grandfathered to allow them to use CFC gas to cool the diffusion process. The pipes leak and a lot of CFC gets out, which is up to 20,000 times more potent at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. Lie number 2. Then you've got to build this great big reactor. When you make concrete, it creates a lot of carbon dioxide. The reactor will only operate for about 30 years before it's so radioactive no one can go in it anymore. So then you shut it down. Then what do you do with it? You have to let it cool, the radiation cool for decades, and then you have to cut it apart by remote control using robots because it's so radioactive. No one's ever done that yet, but that's the plan. Then you have huge quantities of radioactive waste, hot, bubbling, toxic, witch's cauldrons of radioactive waste. What are we going to do with it? Well, they found a mountain in Nevada called Yucca Mountain, which is transected by 32 earthquake faults. One of them's called the Ghost Dance, and that's where they're going to put their radioactive waste, they say. The amount they already have, which is 50,000 tons, but each day they keep making more and more and more of it. They'll have to transport 1,500 shipments of radioactive waste through the highways and byways of America every year for the next 30 years to get rid of what they already have. That's called the Mobile Chernobyl Bill. Because if you're a terrorist and you want to knock out a lot of Chicago, you just hit one of those canisters with a shoulder-fired missile and you can destroy much of Chicago and cause a lot of cancer. So it's perfect for terrorists. Yucca Mountain is made of pumice. Do you know what pumice is? It's that sort of dust that comes out of volcanoes, terribly permeable. It's above an aquifer, I think 65 miles from Las Vegas. And they get their water from there. Oh, it's all a terrific plan. And don't worry, it's all in hand. They've got it organised, and there's no worries about it, as we say in Australia. No worries. Okay, now when you enrich the uranium, you turn it into ceramic pellets just like that. Okay? And you put the ceramic pellets in fuel rods, which are 12 feet long and half an inch wide, like curtain rods. Do you call them curtains or drapes? Curtains. Drapes, we call them curtains in Australia. The Queen's English. And you take them along to a nuclear power plant and you put in 100 tons of fuel rods of uranium, probably from Saskatchewan. And all of this is immersed in water. And between the rods are moderating rods made of... What are they made of? So, what? No, not carbon. Boron. So you pull the moderating rods out slowly and then the atoms start breaking apart spontaneously and you get what's called critical mass and tremendous heat is produced. It's like blowing up a bomb, only it won't explode. But the atoms start breaking apart in a random way and great heat is produced and the heat boils the water. The water boils and is turned into steam and it's taken by a pipe to a turbine and it turns the turbine and that generates electricity. So all a nuclear power plant is designed to do is to boil water. That's the truth. It's like cutting a pound of butter with a chainsaw. It's crazy. And what happens is 200 new elements are made, none of which existed before, all of which are much more radioactive. The uranium becomes 1 billion times more radioactive when it's fissioned in a nuclear power plant. 1 billion times. There's enough radiation in that as the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. They're bomb factories, these things. They're scary as hell. Why did they ever think of making electricity from splitting the atom? I'll tell you why. The old guys who made the bombs, and I worked with them from the Manhattan Project, were so guilt-stricken about killing 200,000 people, as well they may be. They thought they could solve their consciences by harnessing atoms for peace. And they called it sunshine units. That's what they called it. And they said it would be too cheap to meter. I used to argue with them. George Kistiakowsky, Jerry Wiesner, Vicky Weiskopf, all of them, Philip Morrison. They knew how dangerous it was, but they wouldn't admit it. And they went to their graves. They're all dead now, having that on their conscience. Now let's walk you through what some of the elements are. I'll just pick a few out of 200. Some only last seconds and some last millions and millions of years. And this is nuclear waste. Every year they remove 1/3 of the fuel rods, 30 tons. You put 100 tons of uranium in because they're so radioactive and so full of these fission products, they're not efficient anymore. So they put them in what they call swimming pools beside the reactors on racks. And these have to be continually cooled, for if they're not, the rods will melt down like Chernobyl. The reactor itself uses 1 million gallons of cooling water a minute. To use that cooling water, you need an external electricity supply to get the pumps working. In Sweden 6 months ago, they lost the external supply. 2 of the emergency generators failed to fire, and 20 minutes into the accident, they got one going. They were 2 minutes from a Chernobyl-style meltdown in Sweden 6 months ago. Google it. Sweden was so freaked out, they closed down half their reactors overnight. I tell you, when the next meltdown occurs, that's the end of your uranium industry, all your propaganda, all the money that Kojima and Areva put into your hospitals, into your symphony orchestra. I mean, how dare they bribe you? How dare they? This is a death industry. How dare the hospital take money from the uranium industry? What are they thinking? We're trying to cure cancer, find the cause of cancer, yet they're taking money from a cancer-inducing industry. That's immoral. And it permeates your province, this uranium death money. It's like The Sopranos, do you know? Do you watch The Sopranos? Anyway, so they nearly had a meltdown there. These spent fuel pools contain 2 to 30 times more radiation than is in the reactor itself. In this book, there's a study done by people from Princeton to estimate if there was a meltdown in a cooling pool, what it would be like. I mean, much worse than Chernobyl. Incidentally, 40% of the European landmass is radioactive still and will remain so for 600 years. In Wales, in Britain, the farms that grow lambs have had to close down because the lambs are so full of cesium-137, they're radioactive. The government went to the farmers, the British government, said, you have to close your farms. And they said, well, for how long? And they said, oh, about 100 years, 600 years. So let me just walk you quickly through what I'm talking about. Radioactive iodine. What gland in the body uses iodine? Thyroid gland. Especially fetal thyroids suck up iodine like a sponge. Now, the body doesn't discriminate between radioactive and non-radioactive elements. And what happened at 3 Mile Island was a lot of this stuff got out. There was a meltdown at 3 Mile Island, and it landed on the paddocks. Do you call them paddocks? Fields. And so the grass, not knowing this stuff's radioactive, sucked up the radioactive iodine and concentrated it 10, 100 times. And then the cows came along, and I'm not really good at cows, but they have udders. And they ate the grass. And the radioactive iodine concentrated hundreds more times in the milk. Now, guess what? Hershey's Chocolates is 13 miles from 3 Mile Island. Don't eat Hershey's Chocolates. Because a lot of radiation got out, and I write about that. I had a whistleblower who got all the data, and I've put it in this book about 3 Mile Island. But radioactive iodine only has a half-life of 8 days, and you multiply that by 20, so it's only around for about 6 weeks. So what Hershey's did was get all the milk from the cows, and they powdered the milk. So after 6 weeks, the radioactive iodine had decayed, but what else got out? Well, what else got out was something called strontium-90. Strontium-90 you might remember from the days of the weapons testing. That's what Linus Pauling used to talk about. This is a beta and a gamma emitter, beta and gamma. Its half-life is 28 years, so it's around for 600 years. That's why Europe's going to be radioactive for hundreds of years. Strontium-90 bioconcentrates too in the grass and the milk, and the body thinks that it's calcium. So it is deposited in bone, particularly growing bone. And children and babies are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to the effects of radiation than adults. And old people are sensitive too, and people with immune deficiencies are sensitive to getting cancer from radiation, more so. And the industry uses a standard man as their reference. I think he's 5'7" and 134 pounds, no, maybe more. And that's how they work out their regulations for radiation exposure. They don't talk about children or fetuses or pregnant women or old people. I mean, really, it's pathetic. When you think the majority of people on Earth are women, actually, not standard men. Anyway, so strontium-90 goes to bone, concentrates in milk and stuff, goes to bone where it irradiates a small volume of cells with the beta particle, the electron, and years later that child can develop either a bone cancer, an osteogenic sarcoma, or leukemia. Leukemia is cancer of the white blood cells. The white blood cells and the red blood cells are made in the bone marrow. If you mutate a regulatory gene in a white blood cell, later it can become, and the incubation time is only 5 to 10 years for leukemia, malignant. And the blood fills up with immature white blood cells. And it's called leukemia because leuko means white, white blood. You become very anemic because there's no room to make red blood cells. And the immature white blood cells can't fight infection. So patients die of massive infection like patients with AIDS, or they die of hemorrhage because there's no room to make platelets, which cause clotting too. Okay? So leukemia or bone cancer. Now the next one is cesium-137, which I mentioned because Europe is very much contaminated with cesium. It's in the reindeer, it's in the food, it's in the sheep, it's everywhere. Cesium-137 is like potassium. Anyone who knows biology and biochemistry knows that every cell in the body is rich in potassium. The potassium levels in the blood are very, very delicate, and they have to be absolutely normal, or your heart develops irregularities and can stop. Cesium has a half-life of 30 years. It's around for 600. It's a beta and a gamma, and it actually concentrates in muscle, causing rhabdomyosarcomas, muscle tumours, and brain cancer. I rang the man in Melbourne, Australia, who measures the radiation in the food from Europe, And they do random spot checks, and just the computer picks out that batch to check and whatever. And I said, what do you do when you find radiation in the food? He said, we dilute it with non-radioactive food. If you understand the food chain and the bioconcentration, the solution to pollution by dilution when it comes to radiation is fallacious, because it reconcentrates back in the body. Most of the people in charge of our lives are scientifically illiterate, according to David Suzuki. He surveyed your federal politicians and found less than 3% were scientifically literate, so they're actually not appropriately equipped to be your politicians. We need to get people who understand science and who are moral to be the politicians. Now, last but not least, I'm going to describe the other element that's made, and that's plutonium. Who's Pluto? Who is Pluto? Huh? What? What? No, not the other planet. No, that's wrong. The god of hell, not the dog, not the dog, the god of hell. Appropriately named, plutonium. Named by its founder, Glenn Seaborg, as the most dangerous substance on Earth. They're actually more dangerous substances. It's an alpha emitter, highly carcinogenic. So if you took a couple of kilos, you can't, but if you could, and put a little piece in every person's lung on Earth, that's a carcinogenic dose for every human being on Earth. Each reactor makes about 200 kilos of plutonium a year, and you need 5 kilos or less, maybe 3 kilos, to make yourself a bomb. Terrific stuff it is. Makes a big bang. And its half-life is 24,400 years. So it's around for 500,000 years. That's why you've got to store nuclear waste isolated from the environment for 500,000 years. Now, plutonium can get into the lung and where it causes lung cancer. It also is like iron. The body thinks it's iron, so it combines with the iron transporting protein, and it's stored in the liver where it can cause liver cancer. The bone, because that's where the hemoglobin is made, bone cancer or leukemia. It crosses the placenta. The placenta lets very few things past, but plutonium gets in because it's thought to be iron. Where, like the drug thalidomide, it can kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the septum of the heart, right? Remember the thalidomide babies? There's a wonderful tenor or baritone in Germany who's a thalidomide baby. His legs are about that long. He's got no knee joints. He's got 2 hands coming out of his shoulders and this huge head. And he waddles onto the platform and he opens his mouth and he's got this glorious voice. He's a thalidomide baby. We used to have a bumper sticker in Australia which said, plutonium is thalidomide forever, because it lives on to get into fetus after fetus after fetus for the rest of time. Every male has a tiny load of plutonium in his testicles in the Northern Hemisphere from weapons testing days because the plutonium's still falling out. What does that mean to future generations? We don't know because we won't be here to look or to assess. Also, the incidence of testicular cancer is rising. Is it caused by the plutonium, which is so carcinogenic? So nuclear power is about all of these substances and many more that I describe in my book. And for a short time, 30 years, it boils water and generates electricity. So you can imagine our descendants waking up in the morning, the breast milk already radioactive, the food radioactive, the children getting cancer at 5 instead of 60 because they're exposed in utero, epidemics of malignancy and genetic disease. That's what nuclear power means. That's what uranium means. And this is a medical issue. Nothing else, as far as I'm concerned as a paediatrician. That's why doctors have to get involved again. We were involved, we stopped because the Cold War ended. We've got to get involved again because this is the ultimate form of preventive medicine. We've really worked on smoking because it causes cancer, but only in the person that smokes and maybe a bit of passive smoking, but not future generations. This is the legacy we leave to our descendants. Vats of radioactive waste. Now, what happens when we reach peak oil and we think we have? How are they going to transport the radioactive waste that we leave them so we could turn our lights on and our computers? What are they going to do? What about with global warming occurring and many reactors are by the sea and the sea rises 2 feet? The reactors will drown and melt down. What about in France 2 years ago when there was such a heat wave and a drought? The river levels fell and there wasn't enough water to cool the reactors. And the water was 98 degrees or above, which is not cool enough to cool the reactors. So they were spraying the outside of the reactors with garden hoses. So global warming, peak oil, and all the rest mitigate against anything to do with nuclear. And what you could do in this audience, there are enough people in this audience tonight to end the uranium industry. Furthermore, we've got to stop burning coal. And people say, oh my God, you know, what are we going to do? Well, I'm putting together an incredible roadmap with a brilliant scientist in Washington for a carbon dioxide-free future and no nuclear power to generate all the electricity we need. Wind power, you're full of wind. All over Canada, you could develop wind power, export it all over the world, but generate all the electricity you need. Solar power, even in the middle of winter here, you get enough sun to generate a lot of electricity. You've got geothermal energy just below the surface, so hot rocks that can be used for electricity generation and energy. So the answers are all here. We just have to decide what we're going to do. It's so exciting. The answers are cheap, the technology's here, solar power is cheaper by the day. And so we can fix it. We can fix it. And we can produce bilateral nuclear disarmament. Of all the 30,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, Russia and America own 97% of them. Yet they're running around with microscopes, you know, looking at Iran and North Korea. Paranoid, it's called. So we've got a big challenge, but in a way it's exciting because we need not be depressed because we know how to fix it. And the way we fix it is we take it into our own souls and we say, I'm going to fix it. Not, why don't they? Or the aorta syndrome. You know, the aorta is a vessel coming out of the heart. Aorta fix it. Aorta produce nuclear disarmament. I will. The only person who can make this decision to save the planet is you. And I'm getting older. I've got heart disease. I'm 68, nearly 69. I could shuffle off the mortal coil any day. And so therefore I have to hand the flame on, and we can all become Jones and Johns of Arc. But we have to, because if we have grandchildren and children like this one, come up here. How old are you?
I'm 8.
She's 8. What's your name?
Andrea.
Andrea. This is what I've been talking about tonight. Andrea. Okay? Okay, sweet. You can sit down now. So I'll end now and thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, so there are microphones, I think, in each side aisle. So let's take some questions, and not statements, but questions. Otherwise, I'll cut you off. Sure, and I don't mind how provocative it is, or if you really disagree with me. It's fine. Yeah.
I wondered, you said that it was possible for the number of people in this auditorium to make a difference. I wondered if you could elaborate on how that might be done.
No one's ever told me what to do. I've kind of always known. And what I would suggest is that you read these books, particularly this nuclear power book and the new nuclear danger. What else have I got here? Oh, there's one I've just written called War in Heaven about the weaponization of space. I guess if you read these three, and imbibe the information, I think your brain will make a decision about what you best can do. You've all got special facilities. Some are good at media, some are good at writing, some are good at organising, some work at hospitals, ask me to come and do grand rounds at the hospitals. Some are probably real estate agents, get all the real estate agents together because nuclear power is bad for real estate. You can't buy insurance for your house against a nuclear accident. So I guess what I'm saying to you is use your imagination, use your creativity, but use it like you've never used anything before in your life. And your 5 layers of neurons. Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious what the nuclear energy did with all of the water they use. And then another thing, I'm not sure if you know this, but in Canada, we've got the big oil sands project, and what their ingenious plan is to power it with nuclear. They're trying to pitch that idea to the people.
Well, it's great. I mean, get the oil sands out, use lots of electricity and nuclear power to get it, make lots of nuclear waste, and then burn the oil and make more carbon dioxide and more global warming.
And the water, what's done with all of the water and the...
The water that's used for nuclear power and for uranium mining becomes radioactive. A low concentration of radioactivity, but as I described the food chain, these elements bioconcentrate back in the algae, the crustaceans, the little fish, the big fish, and then in us. A nuclear reactor, I said, uses 1 million gallons a minute of cooling water. They suck huge quantities of fish in and kill them into their cooling mechanism. They often block the pipes. You don't eat fish caught near a reactor, but the thing is, fish swim thousands of miles. And a fish doesn't wear a sign saying, I'm full of cesium-137. Fish like the warm water near reactors. They tend to congregate around there and spawn. I've got a book about fish kills that I forgot to bring tonight, associated with nuclear power. So it's terribly dangerous. Oh, and a normal operating reactor emits every second of every day tritium, which is extraordinarily carcinogenic. It emits noble gases, argon, krypton and xenon, which can be inhaled and be absorbed through the lung. They're very fat soluble, so they tend to go to the abdominal fat pad and upper thighs where the gonads are located. They're very high energy gamma emitters. So if you live near a nuclear reactor and there's an inversion system, you can become enveloped in a cloud of tritium, which is absorbed straight through the skin, combines in the DNA molecule, and noble gases, and carbon-14. And I can't remember, does anyone know the half-life of carbon-14? I think it's about 1,200 years. So reactors themselves contaminate the air and the water in the area that they're located. I write all about that in the book. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to have you comment on something, an issue that's never discussed in Saskatchewan and no one wants to talk about, and that is depleted uranium.
Oh,
its
yeah, I
use
forgot that.
in weapons.
Thank you very much. When uranium is enriched and they get out the 235, the other element that's left is uranium-238, and it's lying in millions of tons in what they call tailings piles. They never put it back in the earth. If they put it back in the earth, it's safe. It's emitting radon gas continuously, radium leaching into the water, and it's always in Aboriginal tribal lands. And the incidence of cancer amongst these populations in Australia, and Kojima is in Australia, mining our uranium. We've got to get rid of them. I want to go to jail. I'm sick of what's happening in Australia. I'm going to sit in at Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, and I'm going to get arrested and go to jail. It's my country, and I'm going to stop it. But the uranium-238, which is waste, is terrific stuff because it's 1.7 times more dense than lead. And if you make a solid shell of uranium-238, it develops tremendous momentum. Remember, momentum equals mass by velocity. And it slices through a tank like a hot knife through butter. But when it hits the tank, it's pyrophoric, very reactive. And up to 80% of that U-238 burns, producing particles less than 5 microns in diameter that can be inhaled into the terminal bronchi, where there are no cilia. And like plutonium, it's an alpha emitter and highly carcinogenic. There are 5 ways it can cause cancer. If you go to my website, nuclearpolicy.org, you can download a paper that we did on depleted uranium weapons and how it causes cancer. About 360 tonnes of this ordnance was used near Basra in 1991. And my colleagues noticed 4 years later an increased incidence of childhood cancer. The incidence of childhood cancer now in Basra has gone up 700%. And because of the sanctions and the war, my colleagues can't treat their patients. And there are some childhood cancers we can cure. They have no drugs, no radiotherapy instruments, and they literally stand at the foot of their patients' beds weeping. The incidence of severe congenital anomalies, like remember thalidomide, because it gets into the fetus. Babies born with no brains, anencephaly. I've delivered such a baby. They have a nubbin of midbrain on the vault of their skull, so they cry, cough, sneeze and suck and die within a week. Babies born with no arms, single eyes, cyclopses or severe midfacial deformities has gone up 700%. The women are too terrified to deliver their babies now for fear of what will come out. The half-life of uranium-235 is 4.5 billion years. And almost certainly, much of that uranium that America's using in Iraq comes from here. It was used in Afghanistan, where your soldiers are. It's excreted in the semen, incidentally, and the urine, but the semen. The wives of returned servicemen from Iraq talk about burning semen. It burns the vaginal mucosa. And the children are playing in this dust. They're playing in the destroyed tanks that are polluted with the stuff. And so what they're having over there, they've used much more this time, over 2,000 tonnes, but the Pentagon won't reveal the data, is they're conducting a nuclear war with your uranium. So they're polluting the cradle of civilization where arithmetic was developed and law and writing and everything. And there's virtually nothing about that in the media. I wrote an article for the New York Times and they said, we are unable to publish this. Passive. Like who's telling them they can't? So things are extremely grave. Yeah.
We're just about to have a provincial election sometime soon. We're not sure exactly. We don't have a political party in Saskatchewan that is anti-nuclear. And so I'm just wondering what ideas you might have, because I think it is critical right now.
Yeah.
With the whole issue of climate change and so forth that people have finally sort of become aware of.
Okay, so what you do is make it your business to go and see every single politician who's running for office in this provincial election. Make an appointment. If you know some doctors, take them along with you. They can casually drape a stethoscope around their neck, you know. I'm just joking, but and go and educate them and give them this book and make sure they read it. That can be your job. You organise, if there are enough people in this lecture theatre, you should all sign your names on a piece of paper, email addresses, telephone numbers. You need a telephone tree and organise all the people to go and see every single politician and educate them. This is not political. This is medical. Okay? Yeah. Little one.
Where would some nuclear power sites be?
Darling, speak up. Yeah.
Where would some nuclear power sites be?
Where are the nuclear power stations? You haven't got any here. You just sell the uranium so other people can have the joy. There are quite a lot of them in Ontario, on the lake there. In Canada, how many are there in Canada? What? No, but how many have you got in toto in Canada? What? 19? Yeah. So you've got about 19 in Canada. Your job can be to close down all the nuclear power plants. How old are you? 8. Well, that's good. You can team up with this one. And you know what? If you decide to do that, do you know what? The media will absolutely love you. They'll have photographs of you all over the front page. And if you learn enough and speak enough truth, all the children will follow you like the Pied Piper. Do you know who the Pied Piper was? He was a man who used to play the flute, and all the children followed him, except you're going to be the man now. You're 8 and you're the lady, and you do it together. You go and meet each other afterwards, and you work out what you're going to do. Do you promise me? Okay. Yeah.
I know you said no statements, but I think the Green Party is anti-nuclear. So, you know,
Is it or not?
I don't know. Maybe that's a question. Is the Green Party anti-nuclear?
I do not know, and that's your responsibility to find out. But certainly in Australia, our Green Party is anti-nuclear. I vote a straight Green ticket.
Well, it's something worth checking out anyway.
Well, no, you check it out. That's
will.
your idea. Yeah.
No, it's
and if
mine.
it's not,
Yeah,
make
I'll
sure they
definitely check it
become.
out.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Apparently, according to a group, I think they're called the Campaign to Control Cancer, they're expecting about 150,000 new cases of cancer every year in Canada, and they've also said that Saskatchewan has one of the highest cancer rates in this country.
Oh, really?
Something along the lines of 13 new cases per day, 6 deaths due to cancer every day in this province. And I'm wondering, when I have those kind of statistics, how confident can I be that these cancer rates have some relationship with the uranium mining in this province and just sort of just conditions as generally?
Well, first of all, you need to know where the cancer incidence is highest in this province. And I'm sure that the records that are lodged with the government would show you where the cancer... Now, if it's high near the uranium mines, okay, and lower away from them, you can logically assume that the radon being emanated from the tailings piles and the radium and the like is partly responsible for the high incidence of cancer. So you need to do your own epidemiological check to find out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. 1 in 3 people are going to get cancer anyway in their lifetimes. Often you'll find the nuclear industry deals with cancer mortality, but as we can save a lot of patients with cancer now, it's the cancer incidence that matters, not the deaths from cancer. And anyway, we're not very good at death certificates. We might say a patient died of pneumonia when in fact they primarily died of cancer and got pneumonia as the terminal event. So you need to learn about epidemiology. Yes?
Dr. Caldicott, I read online in an interview with you one day, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the magazine. You talked about the importance of electing women to government office. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit, please.
Yeah. Well, I'm about to write a book, I think, called Why Men Kill. And I'm going to dedicate it to Donald Rumsfeld. I watched him before they went into the Iraq War. I was a visiting professor at Rutgers and lived in this little tiny apartment. And I remember watching him and thinking, oh my God. I want to dissect out the socio-biological factors of killing, the hormonal influence of testosterone versus oxytocin, progesterone and estrogen, the Jungian archetypal symbols that we use in society. Why do we glorify war? Why in every square in Europe is there a killer on a horse? Why do we lock up people who murder in society, yet society as a whole murders in a massive way? Why did I, when I was young, fall in love with alpha males? I couldn't help myself. Did I, was it there's something deep in my genes that I needed a strong man to protect me, or to have a male baby with that sort of genotype that would protect me? I mean, I want to really explore this in great depth. So, and to end, 53% of the world's population are women, and we're absolute wimps. We are. I mean, 53% of every corporation and university, faculty and government should be women. In fact, in France, they have a parity law now that 50% of people running for elected office have to be women. And I hope Royale wins. But I think we hold one of the golden keys to a safe future. And I'll just end by telling you about an experiment which I found fascinating. I mean, I've only just started exploring this. But there was a woman working on hormones in a lab in California, and she noticed when there was an altercation that typically the men would go into their rooms and shut the door and fume. And the women would come in the next morning, clean all the benches and make the coffee and talk, She thought, that's interesting, so she measured the hormones. In the males, the testosterone went sky high. In the women, oxytocin went up. Now, when I did medicine, oxytocin was thought to stimulate uterine contraction in labour. But clearly it's the nurturing hormone which is essential for the preservation of life. And I remember when I had my babies, I felt so nurturing, I thought I could feed the whole world. I felt like that. I used to have great big dinner parties, and I'd be breastfeeding the babies, and by the time I'd cooked all day and breastfed, I was so tired I'd fall asleep in the soup. But I find it absolutely fascinating from a neurophysiological perspective. And I think we've got to look at this more. I think it's going to be a provocative book. It's something that must be discussed, because unless you know the etiology or cause of a disease, you can't cure it. And we have a morbid disease now that's threatening the planet, and that's the desire to kill. You know, Alexander the Great was a psychopath. He killed hundreds of thousands of people. Napoleon was a psychopath, and yet he's got a great big tomb in the middle of Paris. Isn't it interesting? Yeah. So, and then, you know, I'm looking at this awful thing at the Walter Reed Hospital, and these poor kids that come back, 17 and 18 with no limbs and with brain injuries, and they're not looked after or cared for. They have post-traumatic stress syndrome. They never recover. Why do we do that? Send the young things off to kill? Is it because the old men are getting a testosterone deficiency and they feel they need something to boost them? Maybe we should give them all Viagra. I'm just joking, but there's a lot to think about and ponder, and I guess that'll be my last book. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate being here in Canada. Jim, I've finished.
Just so
Oh.
you know, there is something to sign. I got it out of the bathroom. And this is difficult to do, but if you would sign it carefully if you're interested in working on this, and if you would put a star beside your name if you are willing to help organize. So there will be some of you who will be saying you'd be willing to help get it going. And this will be on the table out there.
Good on you, Jim. That's great. And there's one last thing I forgot, and I need 4 volunteers. Will you come up? I want to show you a Trident submarine because you need to be able to visualize these things. America's got 18 Trident submarines, 4 of which have conventional weapons, the rest have nuclear. On each Trident submarine are 24 missiles, and on each missile are 8 hydrogen bombs, each up to 100 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. And there are 14 of these death instruments at sea at any one time, silently patrolling the oceans. This is why the Russians are paranoid. So this is a Trident. Each page represents 1 missile, and each of those black things is a bomb. Okay, so let's actually visualize a Trident. And the captain of a Trident submarine doesn't need to communicate with the Pentagon to launch his missiles. If he became psychotic like Captain Queeg, he could launch them. Okay, so that gives you an indication of where we're at, just a slight one. Thank you.